Hello, I am Professor Kino, and welcome to my Office of Cinematic Antiquity. Today we will be kicking off my end of 2019, beginning of 2020 top 10 lists. I have 4 in mind that I'm going to be doing throughout this month, the first 3 hopefully over the course of this next week, and the final one by the end of the month. I won't get into the details of all of them here, so I might as well jump into my first top 10 list. How my top 10 most anticipated films of 2019 list held up. I obviously had some expectations going into 2019, and I want to see if they were met. Did the films I really wanted to see at the beginning of 2019 live up to my expectations, or did they let me down? Let's take a look. And I do have reviews for all of these films on my channel, so if you want more in-depth critiques, links will be in the description down below. Firstly, I did have one honorable mention on my list, and that was Glass. The reason for its inclusion was because I was excited about the film due to my love of Split, but I was also apprehensive about Glass being the conclusion to one of M. Night Shyamalan's visions, which don't typically have a great track record. And I would say that Glass pretty much was exactly what I expected. It has great acting and a fun and unique premise, but it kind of falls apart in the final act with a twist/conclusion that prides itself on being smarter than it actually is. It's not a bad time, but compared to the promise that Split gave the Unbreakable trilogy, Glass ended the story on kind of a whimper. This leads me into my number 10 most anticipated film of 2019, Pet Sematary. Hot off my love of it and the plethora of other stellar Stephen King adaptations, and impressing me with a brilliantly crafted first trailer, one that I still watch from time to time just because of how good it is, I was pumped for another King Spook Time movie. Unfortunately, the promise of the trailer did not translate into a great film overall. It's just alright, and that makes it a bit of a downer in my book because of how much expectation I had for it. Out of the 3 King adaptations I saw this past year, Pet Sematary is most definitely the weakest of them. For my number 9 pick, I had chosen Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker. I was excited for it because, let's face it, it's Star Wars, and it's the end of a Star Wars trilogy. And while I did have fun with the film, I must admit that I did feel that it was slightly disappointing in how safe it played it. It's not my least favorite Star Wars film, but it's nowhere close to my favorite. It's just somewhere in the middle. And that's fine enough, but I had hoped for better. For number 8, I picked Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I love Tarantino, and so when I see that he has a new film in the works, of course it is going to generate some excitement for me. At the time of making this list, however, I had no clue what the film was going to be about, but I had faith in Tarantino and his abilities. And while Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is not my favorite Tarantino film, it is up there. Compared to his other productions, it is very unique and very personal, and there is something endearing about that. Oh, and the 60s soundtrack is fantastic. All I wanted the film to be was a unique and worthwhile ride, and Tarantino delivered. Next up, at number 7, I had chosen How to Train Your Dragon: The Hidden World. Having loved the first 2 films, which introduced us to some great characters and a wonderfully detailed world, I was hoping that the final installment of the trilogy would end on a powerful note. And while I do think that the film is really well made and animated, I don't think that the film as a whole is super amazing. The villain is kinda weak, and the story didn't feel fully original. However, being a fan of the franchise, I have to admit that the final sequence did bring some tears to my eyes, so if nothing else, I enjoyed it. At number 6, I put the Lego Movie 2. As you can probably guess, I enjoy Legos a lot, so of course I would be down with seeing a Lego movie, especially after the first one and its first 2 spin-offs were rather enjoyable. And I was not disappointed in the Lego Movie 2. Contrary to most people apparently, I liked the second installment more than the first film. I thought its message of sibling connection and communication and growing up was powerful and uniquely told. I thought the humor was a lot more tongue-in-cheek, and it has still made me laugh by my 4th viewing of it. And I thought, as sequels go, this is up there with the best of them. So yeah, the Lego Movie 2 was definitely worth the excitement. Then, at number 5, I put It Chapter 2. Having loved the first It film and seeing the new adult cast for this film shape up during pre-production, I was really ready for this concluding chapter of the story. And while it is nowhere near as amazing as It Chapter 1, Chapter 2 ends everything in a satisfactory way, which is impressive given the dense and wild source material, and provides us with a ton of great performances to make it even better, especially from Bill Hader. So It Chapter 2 managed to land somewhere around where my expectations placed it, although I must admit that it isn't as enjoyable for me on repeat viewing. Still fun, but not as great as I thought it was during my first screening. Then, at number 4, I put Alita Battle Angel. It was a bit of a wild card for me, but I have always loved cyberpunk and Robert Rodriguez, and something about the trailer for this film struck me. I was drawn to it, and from it, I just hoped that the film would be a visually striking crowd pleaser, and I must say that my expectations were not only met, but the film greatly exceeded them. Yes, the film is a bit corny at times and ridiculous at other times, it wears its manga anime roots like a badge of honor, but I fell in love with it, so much so that I have seen it countless times now, recommended to everyone who I have talked to, and have begun devouring the manga it's based on, and I love that as well. So yeah, Alita both met and exceeded my expectations. At number 3 came John Wick Chapter 3 Parabellum. The first 2 John Wick films blew my mind, and that the first film was amazing and the second film was even better in my book. The action, the world building, Keanu kicking ass, just pure spectacle. And since Chapter 2 ended on such a huge cliffhanger, Chapter 3 became a must-see for me, and it didn't disappoint me in the slightest. The first act alone stunned me in its awesomeness. That antique store knife fight was something else. And while by the end I was a little burned out by the film's sheer amount of wonderful whoop-ass, and I still think Chapter 2 is my favorite of the three, I loved every minute of Chapter 3 and can't wait for Chapter 4 in 2021. Then, my number 2 most anticipated film was Avengers Endgame. Having loved Infinity War and getting my mind boggled by the wild cliffhanger of that film, I was literally dying to see how the first 22 films/decade of the MCU would conclude, and it succeeded in blowing my expectations out of the water. I am amazed by how the film played out, connected all of the films, tied everything up, and added in enough surprises to keep me on my toes and invested until the very end, at which point I cried through the entirety of the credits with joy and shock at how great it was. So yeah, it lived up to my expectations, more than I could have imagined, and I must say that the Infinity War Endgame double feature, which I have totally done, is freaking amazing. And finally, my number 1 most anticipated film of 2019 was Godzilla King of the Monsters. Having been a huge Godzilla fan throughout my entire life, he was even the subject of my college thesis paper, I was beyond excited for Godzilla King of the Monsters. All 3 of its trailers wowed me so much that I must have watched each one about 100 times. And while the final product is not perfect in any way, it is a Godzilla movie through and through, and because of that, I was more than satisfied with it. Did it live up to the caliber of being the number 1 most anticipated film on my list, even over Endgame? Well, no, but it sure as hell was a fun time, and as a lifelong Godzilla fan, made me extremely happy. So, all in all, while my expectations weren't met fully across the board, 2019 was a pretty solid year. While not everything was as good as I had hoped it would be, I didn't hate any of the films, and some of them actually exceeded my expectations, and thus is, I suppose, the way that these sorts of lists work. But this is not the entirety of 2019, I actually saw more than 50 films this past year, and so it is time to break all of those down into my top 10 favorite films of 2019, but that'll be with my next video. So if you are interested in checking that out, feel free to subscribe and keep an eye on your notifications. Until next time, I'm Professor Kino, and I look forward to our future discussions.